Welcome to another deep dive with us. You know, when we pitched Pope Benedict XVI for this episode, gotta say, my first thought was, wasn't that the Pope who up and quit?
Yeah, he definitely went against the grain there.
So I thought, okay, maybe this will be a short deep dive, but man, was I wrong. Turns out, this guy's story is anything but simple.
It's a wild ride for sure. I mean, he's this super conservative theologian, and all of a sudden, bam, he's leading this global church.
In a world that's changing like crazy.
Exactly. Talk about culture shock. And then to top it all off, he does something nobody's done for centuries. Just walks away.
I mean, what's the deal with that? That's what we're going to try to figure out in this deep dive, right?
You got it. We're going to go deep into Benedict's journey using excerpts from this YouTube documentary called, get this, Pope Benedict XVI, full documentary biography.
Catchy. What?
Totally. But seriously, to get this guy, we got to start with his theological DNA, the stuff that really made him tick.
Okay, so like Theology 101 with Pope Benedict, what were the big ideas that shaped his whole worldview?
Well, first and foremost, you got to understand, Benedict was all about traditional Catholic doctrine, like hardcore. He was convinced that reason and faith go hand in hand, and that the church is like the last bastion of truth in a world gone morally haywire.
And this is a guy who got nicknamed, what was it, God's Rottweiler?
Oh, yeah, that was him. Pretty intense for a pope, right?
I mean, not exactly the warm and fuzzy image you usually get with those guys. Do you think that nickname, God's Rottweiler, does it really fit Benedict, or is it just, a catchy headline?
It's kind of both, to be honest. He was definitely a fierce defender of the faith, but he was also a deep thinker, super intellectual. For him, it was all about preserving the truth, the way the church had always taught it, like a guardian of tradition.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's rewind back to the beginning, his childhood in Bavaria. The documentary talks about how his family was super Catholic, his dad was a cop, and World War II, messed him up pretty bad.
Oh, yeah. That had a huge impact on him. Imagine being forced to join the Hitler Youth when your whole family hates the Nazis. That's got to leave a mark.
And then there's that story about his cousin, the one with Down syndrome.
Killed by the Nazis.
Awful. I mean, how do you even process all that as a kid?
No kidding. But somehow, Benedict found refuge in theology. He dove headfirst into his studies like it was a lifeline.
And it took off from there, huh?
Big time. He became a big shot in the church, even played a key role in that whole Second Vatican Council thing.
Every time I hear Second Vatican Council, my eyes kind of glaze over. Could you, remind me what the big deal was and what Benedict's role was and all that?
Totally. Okay, so Vatican II, it happened back in the 60s, and it was a total game changer for the Catholic Church. They were trying to modernize, get with the times, And Benedict, he was actually all for it back then, like a young reformer.
Really? Now that's a surprise.
No kidding, right. But then something happened that flipped the script.
Okay, what was it?
The student riots in '68. Benedict was teaching at this university, Tübingen, when it all went down. Protests, chaos, the whole 9 yards. Seems like that experience really shook him, pushed him more towards the conservative side.
Huh. So you're saying this whole upheaval, it kind of set him on the path to, everything that came later.
It definitely seems that way. You can see his conservative views hardening as he moved from being a professor to becoming the Archbishop of Munich, which, by the way, was a job he did not like at first. Being out in public, all those people, it just wasn't his thing.
Yeah, the documentary mentions he struggled with that even after years in the Vatican.
Absolutely. But hey, guess what his next gig was? Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Basically, the Vatican's enforcer of, everything.
The irony. They put the guy who hated crowds in charge of keeping everyone in line.
You said it. The guy actually tried to retire a bunch of times, but Pope John Paul II, who was also a pretty conservative dude, wouldn't let him.
He saw something in Benedict that Benedict didn't even see in himself.
Exactly. It's funny, those two, John Paul and Benedict, they were like night and day, personality-wise. John Paul was Mr. Charisma, the rock star pope.
And Benedict was more the bookish type.
Oh yeah, he was happiest when he was lost in thought or, get this, playing the piano.
Didn't see that coming.
Right. But even though they were so different, they were super tight.
So how'd that happen? A rock star and a scholar. BFFs.
Well, at their core, they were both hardcore believers. They both thought the church needed to hold strong to its traditional values, especially in a world that was changing so fast. That shared belief, that's what bonded them, I think, more than any personality differences.
And then John Paul II passes away, and it's Benedict who gives the eulogy at the funeral. Millions of people watching, all eyes on him. And suddenly, this quiet, reserved guy, He delivers this powerful, emotional speech.
It was like, whoa, where did that come from? I mean, even Benedict seemed surprised by it.
And that moment, that's kind of what made him the front runner to be the next pope, right?
Yeah.
Even though, as we know, he didn't even want the job.
It's crazy, right? The documentary says that when his driver asked him what would happen if he got elected, Benedict said something like, I am so not cut out for this.
Talk about famous last words. And then, boom, he's elected. And apparently, things were a total mess behind the scenes. Like,
Yeah.
they couldn't even find a cassock that fit him for his first appearance.
Can you imagine the stress those tailors were under? Quick, someone get the Pope a robe that fits.
Oh, man, what a way to start your papacy. But hey, ill-fitting cassock or not, Benedict stepped into the role, became Pope Benedict XVI, leading, what, over 1 billion Catholics?
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? And, he might not have had that rock star quality like John Paul II, but he still drew huge crowds.
People wanted to hear what he had to say.
Absolutely. They were drawn to his teaching, his deep theological knowledge. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, there was that whole thing with Islam, right?
The Regensburg lecture, that was a major turning point.
Yeah, instead of glossing over it, let's actually unpack that. I mean, what did he say that caused such an uproar?
Well, he was giving this lecture, and he quoted this Byzantine emperor who basically said that Islam equals violence.
Oh, man. That's got to be a touchy subject, especially after 9/11.
No kidding. And you can imagine it did not go over well with a lot of Muslims. It sparked protests, outrage all over the world.
So what did the Vatican do?
Damage control, big time. They tried to explain what Benedict really meant, smooth things over. He eventually apologized, for causing offense, but he still insisted he wasn't trying to badmouth Islam.
I bet that didn't really help.
Not really. The damage was done. It really shows you how tricky it is for a pope to, balance upholding the church's teachings while also respecting other faiths. It's a tightrope walk for sure.
And it looks like Benedict might have missed a step there.
Yeah, that one was tough to recover from. It makes you think, about what that must have been like for him. This guy, Benedict, he seems like he wanted a quiet life, just reading and thinking. And bam, he's thrown into the spotlight, dealing with controversy left and right.
Yeah, when you look back at his life, it's like this constant push and pull. He wants peace and quiet, to be a scholar, but then he gets thrust into this high-pressure public role.
Right. And the documentary kind of hints at how he coped with it all. Remember how it talked about him playing the piano almost every day?
Yeah, almost like a ritual.
It seems like that was his way to escape, to find some peace in the middle of all the chaos.
I can relate to that.
No.
Obviously, I'm no pope, but when things get crazy, music or a good book, that's my go-to, like hitting the reset button.
Totally. And for Benedict, those quiet moments, they were essential. He needed them to recharge, to keep going. But even with that, the pressure, the controversies, it all took a toll.
And we can't talk about Benedict without talking about the elephant in the room, the sexual abuse crisis in the church. That's a dark cloud hanging over his entire papacy.
Yeah, there's no getting around that. It was a terrible time, and he got a lot of flack for not doing more sooner. Although he did eventually meet with some of the victims, expressed his sorrow.
I wonder, do you think his background, being a theologian so focused on doctrine and tradition, maybe that made it harder for him to really grasp the scope of the problem?
It's possible. The church, it's all about hierarchy obedience, right? Maybe that made it hard for him to fully comprehend what had happened, to really hold those responsible accountable.
It seems like he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to protect the church while also admitting its failures.
Absolutely. And that tension, tradition versus the need to change, it popped up in other areas too.
Like with his statements about condoms and AIDS, the documentary mentioned that whole thing in Africa.
Oh, yeah, that one. That's a classic example of Benedict trying to modernize, but then his conservative views kind of got in the way.
So what happened exactly?
Well, at first he was totally against using condoms, even to prevent HIV, which, sparked a lot of controversy. But later, he kind of backtracked, said it was okay in certain situations.
Sounds like he was trying to find some middle ground between what the church teaches and, the real world. It makes you wonder, did his attempts to change things actually help or hurt his papacy in the long run?
Tough question. On the one hand, embracing things like, YouTube, Twitter, that showed he knew the church had to get with the times.
Yeah, like he was trying to reach people where they were at using technology to spread the message.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, his old school views on stuff like birth control and same-sex marriage, that definitely alienated some folks, especially younger Catholics, made it hard to connect.
So basically, he was always trying to balance these competing forces, but the ground kept shifting beneath his feet. And then in the middle of all this, boom, he drops the bombshell out of here, resigning.
Which, let's be real, no pope had done that in like forever. 600 years. It was a total shocker. Officially, it was because of his health, but you know how it is. Rumors swirled about scandals, pressure, the whole nine yards.
Just think about the weight of that decision. Giving up a position that's supposed to be, like, divinely appointed. That couldn't have been easy.
Not at all. But it shows you something about Benedict. That he was willing to put the church first, even if it meant stepping down. He knew he couldn't do the job anymore, and it was better to let someone else take over.
And doing that, he opened up a whole new can of worms for the papacy. Like, the idea that it wasn't a lifetime gig anymore, that was a major shift.
Major. And it set the stage for Pope Francis, who's taken things in a completely different direction, like you said earlier.
Benedict's whole papacy, with all its twists and turns, is like a bridge between two different eras. A traditionalist at heart, but his struggles and then ultimately his resignation, it kind of cleared the way for a more progressive leader.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Maybe without Benedict, without him trying to make tradition and the modern world work together, maybe the church wouldn't have been ready for someone like Francis.
So maybe, in a roundabout way, even though he didn't plan it, Benedict helped bring about this new era for the church.
Maybe so. History works in mysterious ways, right? Things that seem small, even like failures, they can have huge consequences down the road.
Speaking of consequences, I wonder what people will say about Benedict years from now. Will they see him as a dinosaur clinging to the past, or someone who is genuinely trying to move the church forward?
Now that is the question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's one easy answer. There's just too much to unpack. His childhood in Nazi Germany, his love of scholarship, his deep faith, it all shaped who he was.
Yeah, it's kind of wild how one guy can spark so many different opinions. When we step back and look at Benedict's papacy, like the whole thing, where do you think he'll land in history? Relic of the past or a forward thinker?
Man, that's the big question, isn't it? And to be honest, I don't think there's a simple answer. You've got to factor in everything, you know? His childhood in Nazi Germany, all those years studying. His faith, man, that was rock solid. All that went into making him who he was.
It's like he was a walking contradiction. God's Rottweiler, they called him. Super strict, all about the rules. But then he's rocking the latest fashion, tweeting up a storm, trying to, like, get the church on the same page as the internet.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher, for sure. This guy, he's an intellectual, loves ideas more than anything, but then, wham, he's got to deal with global politics, social change, all that messy stuff.
Not exactly his comfort zone.
No kidding. So yeah, he wasn't always the most in-touch guy. But then he pulls that resignation move.
Talk about a power move.
Right. I mean, traditional, in a way, admitting he wasn't up to the task.
Yep.
But revolutionary at the same time. Nobody had done that in forever.
Benedict really blew the lid off the whole papacy thing, made everyone rethink what it means to be pope in the modern world. How much should tradition matter? What does leadership really look like?
Huge questions. And don't forget, this paved the way for Francis, who's, well, let's just say he's doing things his own way. It makes you wonder, was Benedict's papacy, with all its messiness, was that like a stepping stone to this new era for the church?
Like he accidentally kickstarted a revolution.
It's not impossible. Maybe his struggles trying to blend tradition with the modern world, maybe that prepped the church for a bigger change. A change that Francis is leading now.
So maybe, even though he didn't set out to do it, Benedict kind of set the stage for a new kind of papacy. One focused on social justice, open discussion, helping those in need.
Yeah, the kind of things Francis is all about.
It's funny how history works, isn't it?
Yeah.
Things that look like failures at the time, they can have huge ripple effects later on.
Totally unpredictable.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Benedict's life, I've got to ask you, the listener, something to think about. How much did Benedict's background as a theologian shape his actions as pope? Were his efforts to modernize, like fighting against his own beliefs? Or was he, as some people say, a bridge between the old church and whatever comes next?
Those are some heavy questions, for sure. And I think they're worth chewing on as you keep exploring this guy's story. Benedict might be gone, but the debates about his legacy, they're far from over.
It's incredible how much we can learn from one life, even one as complicated as Benedict's. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Pope Benedict XVI.